Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's especially for giving up your sort of sunny Thursday afternoon. I think it's a Thursday. I haven't really only got in last night from Kathmandu, so I'm not terribly sure what day or time zone it is. But I think that kind of glazed quality of things helps in a sense, because I think a lot of the situations that I try to write about in Deep Field are very much that. They are sort of glazed in a way. They're situations of cultural clash and political and economic and social clashes of different types of organisations and outlooks, and that sort of slightly glazed and jet-lagged sense, I think, contributes to all of that. But I wanted to start by talking really about the origins of the book, and then to go on and talk about some of the experiences in Tuvalu and the Philippines by way of trying to illustrate a little bit how this sort of travel writing, I think, can inform development and humanitarian work. The book started really in part as a result, as a revolt against aspects of the aid world, and in part as a sort of as an accident, as I tried to write in the evenings, and started off sitting bolt upright to write properly and formally, and gradually as the evenings wore on, began to recline more and more until I ended up writing in bed, and so a lot of the book was actually written in bed, and that changes, I think, the perspectives that you have on things. In part, it was also a revolt, and the revolt was against a mild and temperate revolt, it should be said, but a revolt was against some of the restrictions of the aid world that I saw. One of the things, and there might be people here who remember this, that I used to have was a whiteboard in the office in which I used to work, and I'd write words that came up from the world of aid and development practice on this whiteboard. And people would come in and sort of furtively and surreptitiously add to this, and never guess what I've heard today. This is what people are now talking about. And let me give you a sort of 20-second snapshot of the kind of prevailing winds of this organisation at the time. It's a sort of a snapshot of development and humanitarian jargon that is at once folksy, but also slightly militaristic, but also encapsulates some of the kind of malodorous thoughts that have escaped from the mental dungeons of the local business school. And these were things like you might spend your time gathering intel. The intel would inform your programmatic interoperability, which should be underpinned by a sense of practice wisdom, which would be developed by tic-tacking seamlessly with your colleagues to identify your and your institution's value add while you drill down and take deep dives in search of takeouts for low-hanging fruit, all the while remembering to maintain helicopter views. If you ever wish to pause, or say or in any way reflect, boldly announce that you are going forward. And then, of course, there's the process of onboarding. Onboarding was a phrase that I wasn't really particularly familiar with, but sounded more like something that would occur in Guantanamo Bay than in a development agency. So in this sort of world, the kind of mental snapshot of an oddly professionalizing field of work, there are all sorts of kind of restrictions that didn't really seem to provide a sort of a way in which you could address the kind of the real needs and the real kind of work that people were doing. Programs were often described as or the context in which people worked is often described as development challenges. There were risk factors. The complex societies and cultures were reduced to what were called background noise, and all of these would be sort of obstacles to effective outcomes. But this was not the sort of the world of experience that aid workers frequently have. It's not what they talk about in the evenings over dinner. It's not the sort of thing that you reflect on when you try to write in bed. And so I wanted to try to change some of that and to write slightly differently about the actual experience of of aid work, the experience of humanitarianism, and what it was like to do it. So I'd like to sort of illustrate that in a way by talking about Tuvalu and then about the Philippines. And it was clear to me that something was wrong, in a sense, when I visited Tuvalu. It was a sovereign state of 10,000 people. The highest point was 3 meters above sea level. At one point, you can stand on a sort of narrow isthmus between the Funafuti Lagoon. The Funafuti is the main island of Tuvalu, and the Pacific Ocean. And it's no wider than this stage, but you can see the sort of the precariousness in a way of Tuvaluan existence. I'd gone there because I was working on an aid program. There were a number of issues with it. There were delays, there were lack of reports, budgets had begun to slowly go awry, and alarm bells had begun to sound in Melbourne about this. I tried calling Tuvalu, but for some reason there was an issue with the international telephone exchange, and so my calls to Tuvalu ended up going to the Midwest of the United States, where I'd disturb hardware store owners in Ohio, and end up not talking to the local organization I intended to, but to evangelical churches in Wyoming, and get sort of hellfire and brimstone by some representative from the American Christian right. So it was a really sort of odd kind of experience. The only way of trying to deal with this was actually to get on a plane and go there and work out what was happening. The other thing that was kind of concerning was that people in Tuvalu kept talking about singing. And this is not something that was in part of our sort of development. Lexicon, not one of the risk factors that we'd really considered, the importance of singing. And they're going on and on about singing and inter-island choirs, and it just all seemed completely irrelevant and rather problematic. But when I got there, it was quite different. It was the centenary of the inter-island Tuvaluan choirs, which had been founded in 1914 by missionaries, and they'd all come to the main island of Funafuti from all the other islands of Tuvalu. They got their finest singers. They arrived and they had a series of kind of 3 weeks of feasting and celebration and singing for the centenary of this choir, and then they all went home again, and each night, as each subsequent island departed, they'd have another feast and another celebration. So it was 3 weeks of constant feasting, singing, and dancing, and the entire country had basically been cut to the ground to a halt by this. So I'd like to describe some of what I saw there. I was invited to a number of these evenings. Dressed in floral shirts and crowns of frangipani, we made our way to the manyarber, which is a sort of open-sided meeting hall where a lot of these celebrations took place. We processed slowly on ancient motor scooters, a floral chugging that was both stately and faintly comical, as enormous Tuvaluans, festooned in flowers, balanced delicately on their tiny mechanized transports, knees turned out for balance. The manyarber was surrounded by concentric circles of community members, organized, it seemed, hierarchically, and who watched the performances from the cool of the night. Inside, the concentric circles continued, with groups of men and women organized by island, giving competing performances that rose in tempo and volume and drumming to outperform the others. Young girls started first. They danced from a sitting position and were bedecked in flowers and pandanus fronds. Theirs was a slow dance, classically Polynesian, with a gentle sway of shoulders and choreographed arm movements, the calm of the lagoon, before the older women stood to the increased beat of the drums, building on the swaying arms below with full undulations. As the drumming resonated, deep Pacific male voices joined and the tempo grew, before the men too were on their feet, moving with still greater freedom as the drumming and the singing entered a crescendo. Around the edge, the crowds cheered and laughed with ever greater volume and hilarity as jokes were introduced into the routine, a sudden frenetic paddling of imaginary canoes, the stomping of feet, a mock amorous proposal and rebuff. Before long, all were up in a general melee of noise, flowers, and whirling pandanus. Round and round this ritual went, growing louder and more intoxicating with each repetition as each group sought to outdo the other. Unhappy with just one crescendo, some groups repeated the best and loudest bits, succumbing to the excitement, before the next group had their turn. In the confusion, old women armed with bottles of lemon-scented spray-on cologne pumped thick wafts into the energetic dancers as they worked themselves into a fragrant island ecstasy. From behind the manyarber, the feasts were prepared by the women and brought in for the dancers and spectators. Multiple roast pigs turned slowly on spits. Fresh tuna sashimi was cut into mouth-watering slices and doused in seawater. There were buckets of lightly salted flying fish, sweet pandanus desserts, and great mounds of taro and breadfruit. This was proper feasting, food prepared for the entire contingent, hundreds of people every night. And each night there was a new celebration that lasted till dawn as more boats arrived from the islands. Every night for 3 weeks, singing, dancing, and feasting continued, stopping all other activities beyond the preparing of food, training of voices, and picking new flowers for that evening's crowns. Leaving the manyarber after midnight, I set off for a late-night ride on my motor scooter, exploring the nocturnal world of Funafuti. This time I was not a guest, seated in the charmed inner ring of the manyarber, but a distant spectator, lurking on the outskirts as other manyarbers in different parts of the island went through the same rituals. These were smaller and more intense. I had been at one of the great manyarber, a place that occasionally doubled as the country's parliament. It was made of concrete, a sign of wealth, and had elaborately woven pandanus mats on the walls spelling out the names of all the islands in perfect missionary copperplate. The other manyarber were smaller, more modest wood buildings with corrugated iron roofs, but the noise was just as great. The concentric circles were smaller and tighter, and the performances took on a greater intensity. The music continued, hundreds of bodies swaying and singing and drumming in a driven unison that was at once celebration and preservation. The solution to rising sea levels, migration, urbanization, and the decline of island life, it seemed, was to drum louder. Here the edge was harder, more visceral, the circles tighter and the dancing defiant. The effect was of a musical centrifuge whose forces ever magnified and tended in on themselves. The focus was the disappearing point at the center. And later, as I headed back to my hotel, later on that evening, there was a Tuvalu and Fijian reggae ensemble that crooned, "I'll give you fish and chips if you swing your hips," late into the night. But it was clear that something else was going on away from the structures and language and intent of development programs. It was clear that this was a process of cultural survival, and that this trumped really everything else. I'd like to talk about the Philippines for a bit, because I think this moves on from the experience of places like Tuvalu and the threats that they see from climate change and rising sea levels, from migration and urbanization, and from the slow process of change in the Pacific and slow onset disasters, to the Philippines. And I was there a couple of years ago after Typhoon Bopha, which before Typhoon Haiyan was the strongest typhoon that we had ever seen. And if there was a slow process of trying to cling on to traditional cultures in Tuvalu, in the Philippines, a sudden onset disaster, the typhoon, which enacted huge destruction on the southern island of Mindanao, showed some of the fault lines of that society as well, but perhaps slightly more dramatically. And this describes a walk that I took. I walked past corner stores and retail outlets selling pirated DVDs, clothes and food, stores with names like Jolly Ant and Pot Dog. I walked on past the great malls of the city, upper-class malls and middle-class malls, and deep into the Bridgeside slum, where, clustered around a mosque, there were auto rickshaw repair shops deep in oil and clouds of dark soot from coconut husks being converted into charcoal. The upper and middle-class malls were deeply aspirational, Western goods at Western prices, and modelled by Europeans stack the shelves, while the centrepiece of one mall, beneath a fashion boutique whose Gothic script announced that it was called Bum, plastic European mannequins acted out the family ideal. A blonde, muscular male mannequin stood over a reclining bikini-clad female mannequin with two plastic blue eyes, and plastic toddlers played with equally synthetic toys in a plastic fantastic universe of fake beachside glamour. Further on, glass cabinets advertised Fairlane homes, designer prefabricated houses dominated by enormous garages, where outside models of American cars asserted that, in a miniaturized world, the occupants had arrived. A sleek young woman handed me a flyer, Fairlane homes, it said, moving to a better future. But if the ice-cold artificiality of the malls was the new commercial and cultural centre of the Philippine social life, then the cockfighting arena represented the brutal and bloody opposite end of the spectrum. The sanitized, climate-controlled paradise now of the shopping centres gave way to the death, dust, beer and cigarettes of the cockpit. Walking past the Galleria Martina, a large wooden octagonal building on the way down from the walk, I heard a massive roar of noise, a barrage of sound. Male voices in unison erupted from the Galleria, and after a few minutes as I got closer, the sound stopped, and there was complete silence again as another bout started amid the deep concentration of men absorbed in a blood contest. This was a sport so important that wealthy politicians were known to fly their favourite beasts by Learjet to major derbies, while American and Filipino enthusiasts had organised an international competition won by an estimable bird from Louisiana known as the Rapist. But what I assumed had been the roar of victory, the cockfighting equivalent of scoring a goal, a kill, was in fact the round of betting before the next fight. A sandpit stained with blood and covered in feathers stood at the centre of the Galleria, while advertisements for chook feed and rising politicians adorned the walls. Rising steeply on each side, surrounding the pit, were packed stands with special seats at the ringside for dignitaries. I took my seat at the back, and in the gods of the cockfighting world, peering down at the diminutive chickens below. Suddenly the roaring started again, and the stadium erupted, with everyone on their feet, waving their hands and offering 10-fingered odds to everyone else in the stadium, attempting to find a series of betting partners who would offer the same odds, in a kind of chook-centric version of traders on the stock exchange floor. I made a quiet bet with a man next to me, 100 pesos for a large white rooster with an imposing manner against a smaller but potentially more agile, darker bird. The bout was almost over before it had begun. After parading the roosters for the betting public, they were then aggravated by being held down while other roosters pecked at their heads. Once sufficiently annoyed, both roosters were placed on the sand and pushed encouragingly towards each other. The dark, agile one moved immediately, leaping high above the head of its larger and more threatening foe, and kicked back with its right leg in a single elegant leap. The 5-inch stiletto razor, sharpened only at the eclipses and the dark of the moon, attached to the rooster's heel, sunk deep into the opponent's neck, and the white bird, without moving a step, sank lifelessly into the sand in an instant kill. The death of the rooster came as a shock, and I immediately regretted the bet that I had so cheerfully and unthinkingly entered into a few moments before. Subsequent bouts were neither quick nor pretty. There was no majestic athleticism to the fight or the ritual of sporting bravery that provides a thin veneer to the brutality of blood sport. Following each round of crazed betting, more roosters would be tooled up with vicious spikes, tormented and set against each other in contests that usually resulted in a lethal stalemate, in which both animals, hacked and bleeding, would collapse alongside each other, only to be picked up, roused, and set against each other again. Outside the cockpit, trails of blood led to teams of men trying to stitch up the wounded birds that could be prepared for breeding or to return to the ring again. But there was more to the fights than the numbing succession of death and gore. As I left, crowds of beggars asked if I'd been successful with my betting and pointed to their stomachs for food. Inside, the betting, while complex, saw the exchange of small amounts of currency and minute bills folded many times so they could be kept between the thumb and forefinger of the right hand. This was, in the phrase of Jeremy Bentham, made famous by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, an exercise in deep play, a game in which the stakes were so high that no rational person would play it. They played nonetheless because the deep play represented not only the need for cash by people who had little and in the typhoon had lost so much, but a cultural interpretation of reality. Gone were the sanitized shopping malls. The tiered walls of the Galleria Martina were themselves a rounded cyclonic formation around the still eye of the cockpit, as the commotion of the betting formed a wall of sound around the death ritual at the center. This was, in a way, an avian passion play in which the known outcome was less important than the performing of it. In a country where newborns are carried until they're 6 months old because they are thought to be descended not from the prosaic act of birth, but from the heavens, cockfighting is a counter-reality, the experience that underpins and is the frightening opposite of the sterile aspirations of economic and social progress. The cockfight is, as Geertz wrote, disquieting because it's a cultural figure against a social background. The fight is at once a convulsive surge of animal hatred, a mock war of symbolic selves, and a formal simulation of status tensions. As the crowd roared, pitiful amounts of money changed hands, and, in the still of the storm, animals, in a way more valuable than their owners, fought to the end. The intensity of the betting, the tiered, socially hierarchical stands, and the concentration of the crowd during bursts of feathered fury stripped back layers of interpretation and merged slowly in the imagination with the cyclonic churning of mud, stone, water, and earth, as poor villagers paid the ultimate price of being at the bottom of the economic and status pyramid, and thus at the front of the destructive social power of natural disasters. So that was a short walk in the Philippines, but I wanted really to end there, and I think that with a couple of reflections perhaps on how this sort of writing can relate to the world of development. In part, as I said at the beginning, it's a bit of a revolt against some of the restrictions and the mental parameters of the aid and development world. In part, I think too that it connects the centre and the periphery, the economic and political centres of power, with places like the Philippines and Tuvalu, where these things are played out. Writers, I think, can play a role in that because of the subjectivity of what they write. They can be part of both worlds, and they can interpret each other and allow us to see issues differently. I think too, when it comes to fault lines, these are dramatically illustrated by disasters. So we can see the sort of social and economic and political fault lines as they emerge as a consequence of typhoons and of climate change and of conflict. And this sort of writing over and above the kinds of largely unread reports of development agencies can begin to explore what those actually mean and how we can deal with them. Thank you.
If anyone has a burning question for Tom about his work or his writing, or perhaps both. Perhaps I'd like to ask you a little bit about, you described so beautifully the immersive kind of nature of experiencing ritual in a community, and I'm wondering about the process of writing that. You're writing from bed, we know about the bed revolution, but how that sort of stays with you, how your reflection of that changes perhaps. I mean, I'm reading it as a parallel, as you just described, to the aid work, to the development work as well. Can you talk a little more about that, or does that interest you to talk about?
Yeah. I mean, so I think what's interesting in a way is that during the day, I mean, there's certain tasks that you have to perform in sort of development agencies, and these are quite deterministic in a way. But what becomes interesting are the stories at night, and the anecdotes and the reminiscences, and that's where, in fact, also often a lot of decision making occurs as well. It's where networks are built, where relationships are made. It's often where humanitarian sort of decisions are often made in those contexts over dinner, and rather than in the sort of the formal world of development. So I think that in a way there is a parallel between the social rituals of kind of development workers and humanitarian workers, and the kind of rituals that they witness and that they see on the ground in front of them, and writing about that is a way of trying to bring them together, trying to connect them, rather than superimposing some kind of development expectations onto other societies. It's a way of discussing and analysing and interpreting through each other's rituals in a way.
And to make an obvious point, the big connector being like the beauty and the violence of both of those, the ritual and the actual development work that you're observing from the outside.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Tom? I mean, I can hog the mic, of course. I'm happy to. Oh, great.
So I was just curious as to what came first. Were you an aid worker before you were a writer, or have you been a writer and that kind of took you into aid work?
I was a tourist, first of all, and I was a tourist in Pakistan in 2005, and I'd gone there in part to go and look at some of the remains of Greco-Buddhist civilization in the northwest frontier. That were left over from the invasion of Alexander the Great's armies centuries ago. So you could walk around the northwest frontier and you could find these Buddhist stupas. You could find Buddhas with curly hair and togas. You could find coins with the head of Alexander the Great on the back, and all these extraordinary remains of kind of cultural fusion and cultural traditions that were in the northwest frontier. And then while I was there, there was an earthquake. This is in 2005, and there was an enormous earthquake. I think 3 million people were left without homes. About 80,000 people were killed, and so I found myself in this world of unintentionally and unexpectedly of aid work. Yeah.
Hi. You talk a little bit about a game where the stakes are so high that no rational actor would play, and yet the Tuvaluans are forced to play it. And I suppose apart from the preservation of culture, what sort of action are they taking to preserve their place?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's that's one of the sort of the I think the really sad things about Tuvalu is that people are aware of the uncertainty that faces them. One of the people that I used to work quite closely with, he migrated to Auckland a little while ago, and there was this sort of when I was there, there was quite a agonizing process of decision making. Did he stay there? Or did he go? What opportunities would there be for his children in Tuvalu versus being in New Zealand? If it was good, if being in Tuvalu and growing up there was good enough for him, would it be good enough for? Why wasn't it good enough for his children? And eventually, he decided to uproot as many Tuvaluans and many Pacific Islanders more generally do. There's a certain amount I think that development agencies are and can do in terms of risk reduction, in terms of climate change adaptation, but really I suspect that people are taking things into their own hands. I think that they're leaving at the same, and that just intensifies some of the rituals that are there. So the importance of the choirs was basically to re-emphasize traditional cultures which are very much under threat. And the responsibility of that obviously doesn't lie with 11,000 Tuvaluans in the middle of the Pacific.
Hello, Tom.
Hello, Julia.
I was just wondering if you're finding your quiet revolution is having an effect anywhere in the field.
Dramatic and immediate. Well, actually, I think in a way it is, and I think it's not just my revolt. I think there are a number of people who are thinking along similar lines. And I think one of the things that struck me, there was another writer called Gordon Peake who wrote a very similar book, and in some senses the books were interchangeable but written about very different places. And there was a kind of a meeting of minds about the limitations in some senses of the development world. So I think that there are a number of people out there who are beginning to write more and more about their work, about humanitarianism, about the restrictions that are placed on them, which can't be articulated in any kind of formal or institutional sense, but which can only go through other forms, through writing, through talking, through art. And I think a lot of humanitarians are basically frustrated writers. They go to all these interesting places, they see all sorts of extraordinary things, they are in a sense, at the forefront of the way global politics plays out, which is always at the periphery rather than at the centres of power in Canberra and Washington and London. It's always in places like Tuvalu and the Philippines and South Sudan and so on, where this sort of stuff occurs. But there's no formal mechanism for them to talk about those experiences and what it's like, and so they begin to write. And I think that there's a growing groundswell of people who are beginning to do that.
Thanks. How has writing changed your approach, or has it changed your approach to development work?
I think it's made me less interested in formal processes and procedures, and I think that the work that I do now is very much has taken me away, I think, from that sort of programmatic work where you do have to follow programs and procedures and reporting and all this sort of thing, and is much more about what happens during an emergency. So I'm a sort of disaster coordinator, and it's all about the context, and it's all about the people, and it's all about trying to work within those contexts and to understand it better. So I think it's really invaluable because it's all about relationships ultimately. And we have a phrase in sort of aid coordination that all you have to do is charm and disarm, and that seems to be what it's largely about. It's about the relationships and the people, and trying to figure out the social and cultural and political context in order to get things done. And that changes massively from place to place, and you can't just superimpose a sort of a structure on that.
Thanks, Tom. I think you're right that some development workers are frustrated writers, but sometimes maybe it's also what they're seeing and experiencing that writing, like alcohol or cigarettes, is something that helps them deal with it. You've been to a lot of conflict and post-conflict places. Is it something that changes you as a person? And going forward, can you keep doing that work indefinitely? Or, is there a time in the future where you absorb too much and have to do something else?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dara. I mean, I wonder if you can answer that question. You've also been to a number of conflict and disaster places as well. I mean, I don't know that that is a particularly sustainable profession in that sense. It is difficult, I think, to go from one disaster to the next. I think it does take a toll, and I think that's particularly the case in conflict zones, where both the things that you witness are much more dreadful, but there are also things that are entirely preventable. I mean, I've just come back from Nepal. It was an earthquake. It's an act of sort of tectonic. The release of tectonic pressures is not a deliberate thing that one group of people are doing to another. So I think, and then the compounding problem I think in conflict zones is that agencies themselves really probably can't do a lot about it. I mean, they can keep people alive, they can run refugee camps, they can distribute relief items and so on and so forth, but they're not necessarily a part of an overall political solution to conflicts. And I think that in aid work, I mean, that can be the most dispiriting thing, is knowing that this can just grind on and on and on. Natural disasters, I think, are slightly different in the sense that you can do something about it. I mean, there is a finite point of reconstruction that you can come to. Every week in Nepal, we track the number of items that have been distributed, and you can get a sense of satisfaction about that you're actually doing something towards a finite conclusion. But it does take a toll. I don't think you can do it forever, and I think that writing about it is a way of trying to put all the pieces together. and you go from places like Tuvalu to the Philippines to Nepal to South Sudan or wherever it might be. And this is a sense of trying to weave some kind of coherence to those experiences.